Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things, although marginally less special because the spinny thing isn't going today. I'll explain why later. This fella here, this is Sheriff Fortuna, Wink, and he is a recent release from 3D Breed. They've just had a massively successful Kickstarter for their Join or Die Wanted miniatures, and they're fantastic. They've recently arrived to backers, so they should be up on their store soon. Now this is a 3D print, but remember as well, 3D Breed do have producers and printing partners worldwide, so if you haven't got a printer at home, don't worry, you will still be able to get one of these guys. So, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So once you've got your sheriff all cleaned up and cured, it's time to prime him. Now, in this case, I've used Corax White, which isn't available anymore. It doesn't really matter. What I'd suggest is any white will do the job here. I'm using Corax White because it's what I've got, but the new white primer from Citadel, Army Painter, or anything really, as long as it's got a relatively smooth finish, you should be fine. Now the first color that we're going to apply is actually Wraithbone. Reason being, I do want him to be very bright. I want that comic book style to his look. But if I apply Guilliman Flesh, for example, straight over the top of white, it will be really pale. He's going to look sick rather than pale. So a quick coat of this on all of his skin. That'll give us the right tone underneath that Guilliman Flesh for it to really work. Now he's probably going to look quite sick once you've applied that. What I've got next is Administratum Grey. Now you could use Grey Seer here, but I'm using this because it is a little bit darker. What I want for his vest is for it to go a flatter black than his hair will. So because Black Templar sort of has a blue-black finish, if we put it over a grey, or a darker grey anyhow, it's going to come closer to true black. Alright, now the first of the colours that we're actually going to apply is going to be some Guilliman Flesh. I'm going to do this now because his bandana is one of the areas where I am most likely to make a mistake and hit it while I'm trying to work. So I figure if I start from the bottom and work my way up, I can do any tidy up I need to later. So I've got here, this is one of the Army Painter Hobby base coating brushes. And aside from being quite a mouthful, I really like that they've got quite a long body, but then a fairly sharp little tip at the end, which I tend to find is good for applying contrast to small regions. So, as expected, I did get a little of that on his bandana, but the rest has come out quite well. Honestly, I don't know why I spent years practicing how to paint faces when Guilliman Flesh was just going to happen one day. Anyhow, let's move on and we're going to paint his shirt. I have here Iandan Yellow. Now, there have been a couple of new contrast colors arrive since the first wave came out, and you might want one of those other yellows here. It is up to you. Again, I'm just using what I've got. One of the things that I really like about using contrast on miniatures like these is people can see immediately what you've got in mind. The style for them, some folks don't like, and that's fair enough. But this really bright look, he's definitely going to stand out from the rest of my Western figures. Now his trousers are always shown as being blue. I kind of assume they're jeans, but I'm using here Ultramarines Blue. And let's go ahead and just apply a quick coat of this, stopping at the turn-ups. Now, Ultramarines Blue is one of those colors which will look super dark going on, but as it settles and dries, you will get something much nicer. So, gotta hold your nerve, make sure you are applying enough. It will lighten up, don't worry. We'll now move on to a little of that cleanup. So I'm going back here to Corax White from the pot. Obviously, if you had used a pure white primer, then just use a white here. All I'm going to do is make sure that all of the little bits that I have splurged over so far are white again. Alright, with those little bits all tidy up, we can carry on now. Now the cuffs on his jeans, the turnbacks there, ordinarily on the comics they are shown as being white. You can do them white. What I'm going to use here is Space Wolves Grey, and same as with our blue from earlier rather. This is going to look going on, but it will lighten up as it dries. I know that's the step that's going to get me told off for doing it wrong, but I do want a slightly, I hesitate to say more realistic look, but the white, you'll see what I've got in mind a little later on. We'll move on now to Black Templar, and I'm going to paint in his vest. And hopefully we'll see straight away, that the grey rather we put down first is going to help with the appearance of the black. Now at the same time, if you want, you can paint in his hair with Black Templar like I have. It's going to look a little different to the vest, or you could paint it in with a normal black paint, but it's up to you. I have the Black Templar right there, so why not? We're going to paint in now his bandana, and no great surprise, I have Blood Angel's red here. Let's get him at the right angle and start applying this. Now, to my eye, once the red goes on, that's when he starts being really recognizable. I'm going to use here snakebite leather for the leather, but it does change a little bit depending on which era you're looking at him from. You could also use wildwood if you want a much darker finish, but I think this is going to be the right choice. So, snakebite leather over, no great surprise, the leather parts. Now finally, the last of the contrast colors we're going to apply as our base coats, I have here Apothecary White. And let's go ahead and blop this all over his hat. Doesn't need to be quite that thick, I will spread that out a little bit more, I think. As well, you could do the cuffs of his jeans with this as well, if you preferred. Now I've got myself a small layer brush and some iron hand steel. What I'm going to do is paint in those few metallic details. So his belt buckle here, I'll probably do off camera just to be on the safe side. Now I hesitate to say in reality once again, but Luke, as far as I'm aware, didn't wear a star, but we'll paint it in silver now anyhow. And things like his gun and his spurs. There is one detail I'd honestly forgotten, and if you want to call attention to it, what I have is a little bit of Gryph-hound orange, and I'm just going to paint in a tiny wee orange dot, so that I can see where my brush is, on the end of his cigarette. Now strictly speaking, this isn't a base coat, but I'm doing it at this step because I think this is going to help. Just a tiny wee splash of Nuln Oil on a couple of the silver areas. Not going to go over all of them, just his badge and over his gun. And there at last, well, pretty much everything is done. Now from here you could just varnish him up, put a base on him, and put him on the table. Yeah, he looks fine as he is. But I do want to take him a little bit further. So what I'm going to do is turn to a couple of colours we've already used. I have here Wraithbone and a nice sharp brush. What I'm going to do is just a few little flicks at the extreme edges of any areas of detail. So along with shirt, let's just get a few little lines in here. And one of the good things about using such a bright color for a highlight is that it doesn't make our extremely saturated colors look out of place. What I've got now is the other color we've already used. I have Administratum Gray, and we're going to use this to highlight the black. Now I would recommend here, don't go overboard with this. Just a little of this at your corners and edges is going to be plenty. Otherwise this whole thing is going to look gray rather. Now to highlight his trousers, we're going to introduce a new color. I have here Rust Gray. And this is a nice, well, grayish blue. Same as before, we just want tiny little hints of color just to describe some edges. And carrying on the Space Wolves theme, a little Fenrisian grey on the cuffs, if you've painted them in blue. Now when it comes to the leather, I've got here Corax stone. Now this is quite bright by comparison, so we're following the same idea, just little sketchy highlights. Now for his skin, I have here Flayed One Flesh, and I'd recommend don't thin this down as much as you ordinarily might, because you do need it to cover here. I'm going to start by just picking out the back of his knuckles. This miniature actually has delicately sculpted fingernails, which I don't think I've seen on many, on many models. And as well, up on his face, a little bit on his nose, accentuate that chin, and across his cheeks as well. And then, if you're feeling really fussy, what you can do is pop a little bit of Wraithbone into that skin color. And what I'm going to do is just a last couple of dots here and there. Now that is far lighter than I would ordinarily paint a face, but like I said earlier on, I do want to try and chase that comic book look, and bless him, but looks pretty pale for a dude that spends so much time in the sun. Speaking of really bright, what I have here is Troll Slayer Orange, and what we're going to do is the red. This is leagues beyond what I would ordinarily highlight red with, but I want to lean into the really scalding highlights with this stuff. So what I'm going to do, the reason why I like this color, is I can lay it down, let it dry for a couple of seconds, and then when I come back and apply another little dot, it really helps to saturate that color. So, let's do red highlights. Now to highlight those couple of silver bits that we've done, any bright silver color is going to work just fine. I'm going to use Stormhost Silver, because I want a real shine, and we'll just dot in corners of this totally legitimate badge that he's wearing, and I'll get a little of his gun as well. And now I'm fairly certain the final highlight, I have here White Scar, and I'm just going to run my brush along the edge of his hat. If you wanted a smoother finish here, what you could do would be to do this first of all with Corax White, if that's the base coat you've used. But I quite like a really sharp, bright white here. Alright, then all that remains is to base him and give him a varnish. But there's something else that we need to finish first, because what is Lucky Luke without the smartest horse in the West to help him? Now, Jolly here, you'll see I have painted in some of the details already, and I've been doing everything that I've been doing on the other Luke with this fella here. So he's pretty much finished, and I find that's an easier way to do it. Just paint the rider at the same time. The leather being the exception because that's a little bit more involved, so while I had that paint out, it made more sense to do it then. But painting Lucky. Well, let's start off first of all by laying down the white, and for this we're going to go straight back to Apothecary White. So this time, because the areas on him are much larger, I'm going to be using here a medium layer brush. I'm going to start up close to areas that I want to stay white, push in, and then paint away from them. Now, as with any other contrast color, it's important that once you start one area, you finish it. Otherwise, if you half do an area and then come back to it later with more contrast, you're going to get weird tide marks. So work on one area at a time while your contrast is wet. Now what's funny is that on a white backdrop and base, he looks super blue, but later on, that's going to almost disappear. What I have now is Basilicanum Grey, and we're just going to paint in the bottoms of his hooves. Still using that medium brush, Jolly's usually shown as being yellow-haired, and I don't want to. I know I'm not going for realism here, but there's a lot of yellow on this fella already, so I have Skeleton Horde instead. And we're going to use this to paint in our blonde horse. Now, same as before, we're really just laying down base coats. So I've got Blood Angel's red again, and I'm going to cover in his blanket. In hindsight, I probably would have found this easier to do this before painting in the horse's body, but, well, I like a challenge. Now, while that dries, I've put a tiny dot of Black Templar into his eyes, and now I'm going to go back to some of the Corax white from earlier. And again, if you started from a white primer, well, use white here. What I'm going to do is basically cover over most of the horse again, but leaving that slight shading in the recesses. Now, particularly on this miniature, this is going to be really easy because the sculpting, it is really nicely done. So I can see pretty much everything that I want to go back to that normal, well, off-white color. Now this is going to be the time-consuming part. So pop on some music, and I'll meet you in a couple of minutes. And if you are more patient than I am, which is not impossible, you will probably get a much nicer result than I have. What I've got now is a little bit of Terminatus stone, and I'm going to lightly dry brush just along the edges of the mane. Now there is one last really prominent detail on Jolly, and that is the big brown spots on his butt. Now, in order to make sure that we don't do these too dark, I'm just going to shade them in. So what I have is some Agrax Earthshade. I've got the old stuff, the new will probably work just the same. And what I'll do is just one little circle, and oh, I might have put a little, that's a little high. Oh, it doesn't matter. And this is also a really useful way of demonstrating that wherever you lift your brush away is where you'll get that spot of shade underneath. So let's do the other side. And once I've done this, I'm going to paint a black stripe on his blanket. I'm just going to use some ordinary black paint for that. Then at last, I am going to go ahead, take this fella outside, matte varnish them, pop a base on. And I'll put the recipe for those in the description. You literally cannot get simpler. And there we have it, both miniatures finished. And you did watch me paint the Agrax Earthshade on both sides of Jolly Jumper. So I swear you know both sides of these guys are painted. It's just a case that getting them both to spin round properly fortunately wouldn't really keep them both in focus. So for that reason, we're going to skip the spinny thing. We'll just do a little bit of a showcase here. Now this was a blast, and I really hope that this goes some way to demonstrating that contrast can be super useful as a method to take a little further. You know, there wasn't any complex mixing. All I did really was just a highlight or two over that initial contrast. So as base coats, they work super well, particularly if you do deliberately want to go for that high-end cartoon style. And I'm really happy with how these have turned out. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.